Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is my honour to rise today and voice my support for Bill C-300, an act respecting a federal framework for suicide prevention. I also want to congratulate my honourable colleague from the other side of the House for bringing forward an issue that I think is truly important to every single MP and Canadians right across the country, no matter what colour your tie is. This is an important issue for all of us to address. This bill, Mr. Speaker, enacts and establishes a requirement for the Government of Canada to develop a federal framework for suicide prevention in consultation with relevant non-governmental organizations, the relevant entity in each province and territory, as well as the relevant federal departments. But we believe, Mr. Speaker, that more could have been done with this bill. It is a great first step, but we believe more could have been done. We presented some amendments at committee to make this bill stronger, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that Canadians had a bill that really looked at encompassing everyone, to include First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as well. So, as we say, Mr. Speaker, we will move forward with good faith in this bill. As we mentioned, we do believe it is a good first step. Suicide, Mr. Speaker, has a major impact on Canadians today. It is the second leading cause of death amongst 10 to 24-year-olds and the third leading cause of amongst 25 to 49-year-olds, Mr. Speaker. Furthermore, the stigma that surrounds mental health and suicide has long delayed a national dialogue about the issue and how to address this issue. And I am so happy, Mr. Speaker, that we're able to rise and start talking about this on the national stage. Some of the highlights from this bill, Mr. Speaker, that, certainly suicide is a tragedy for many Canadians and their families. Given the current statistics that I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, it is likely that most Canadians have been impacted by a death by suicide. Suicide, Mr. Speaker, is entirely preventable through a combination of knowledge, care, and compassion, Mr. Speaker. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we in the NDP support this bill put forward by my honourable colleague. We think a national suicide prevention strategy is something that families and stakeholders have been demanding for years now. The NDP has consistently worked on this issue, I should note, Mr. Speaker. In the past and in just this past year, in 2011, my colleague from Halifax put forward Bill C-297, an act respecting a national strategy for suicide prevention. My friend's bill already calls for the provinces, the territories, and representatives from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people to work together to create a national strategy for suicide prevention. Mr. Speaker, this bill would ensure access to mental health and substance abuse services, reduce the stigma associated with using mental health and suicide-related services, establish national guidelines for best practices in suicide prevention, work with communities to use cultural-specific knowledge to design appropriate policies and programs, Mr. Speaker. Of course, coordination of professionals and organizations throughout our great country in order to share information and research and support for healthcare professionals and others who work with individuals at risk of suicide. Mr. Speaker, my colleague's bill, I believe, is our template of how we believe we should approach a national suicide prevention strategy, as it would allow for best practices to be set up, particularly for at-risk communities, Mr. Speaker. Some key facts and figures about suicide in Canada are very disturbing, Mr. Speaker. 10 people die every day by suicide. Over 3,500 people die by suicide annually. And in the past 20 years, more than 100,000 Canadians have died by suicide. In Canada, the number of people affected by suicide due to the loss of a loved one, friend, or co-worker is estimated at 3 million. And I am, unfortunately, one of those 3 million, Mr. Speaker. Back in 1986, 26 years ago, my brother-in-law decided to take his own life. And I can talk about how a family goes through that type of trauma and what the family to this day still goes through. Many times, Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving, any family gathering, you talk about what it would be like to have that individual back with you as a family. And of course, there's always those things of doubt. What could we have done to make things better? What could we have done to change what has happened? And there's really nothing at the end of the day that we could have done, because the person, my brother-in-law, needed some help. And what we could have done is tried to find ways to get him that help, and I think this national strategy is doing what we can to ensure that no other person, and I hope we all can understand that no other person ever has to go through this, and no other family ever has to go through this. So, Mr. Speaker, if we're looking at international comparisons, both the United Nations and the World Health Organization have recognized suicide as a serious and priority public health issue. We were once a world leader on suicide prevention, but now, Mr. Speaker, Canada lags behind other industrialized countries. In 1993, at the invitation of the UN Centre for Social Development and Humanitarian Affairs, Canada hosted an international experts meeting to develop UN-supported suicide prevention guidelines. Following the release of these guidelines, both the United Nations and World Health Organization called upon every country to establish not only their own national strategy, but also appoint and adequately fund a coordinating body responsible for suicide prevention. Whereas Australia, New Zealand, Wales, England, Norway, Sweden, Scotland, and the United States, to name a few, Mr. Speaker, now all have national suicide prevention strategies that have proven to work, Canada still does not. And I think, Mr. Speaker, with this bill, we're getting one step closer, but as I mentioned at the top, we will continue to work to try and make this bill stronger. Let's look at our statistics in Canada. They show that Canada has a higher suicide rate, for example, than the United States. And it is in the top third of developed countries with the highest rate of suicide. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada has stated in the past that the Mental Health Commission of Canada framework already covers suicide prevention. However, Mr. Speaker, their important 2009 report, a framework for a mental health strategy for Canada, only briefly touches on the issue of suicide, and it doesn't even specifically include in it any of its seven recommendations. And it does not constitute, Mr. Speaker, a suicide prevention strategy. All experts and stakeholders agree that their mandate does not properly cover the issue of suicide prevention. And as yet, there is no sign that the MHCC is doing the necessary work that is needed on this issue, Mr. Speaker. The MHCC is focused on bringing about long-term fundamental changes with respect to various mental health issues, while a national suicide prevention strategy is desperately needed, especially today, given the crisis facing many communities, Mr. Speaker. The MHCC even notes that suicide is often 95% of the time, but not always associated with the presence of a mental illness. A suicide prevention strategy is needed because it is distinct from the issue of mental health. Mr. Speaker, let me quote from a media article today from Vancouver Island First Nations, where they've declared a state of emergency because over the last few weeks they've seen the number of suicides in their communities dramatically increase. I believe it was 4. Leaders of this Vancouver Island First Nation have declared the state of emergency over the recent spat of suicides and attempted suicides. And according to the chief, unless they receive support from the feds and the provinces, we may lose more community members to what feels like a hopeless situation. And although we have provided some resources, it is very limited and employees are overtaxed and the burden of double duty. Mr. Speaker, that is why we truly need a national strategy on suicide prevention. I know my time is running out, Mr. Speaker, but with that, I'll just mention again, we support this bill as it's presented, but we would definitely like to see more amendments and things brought forward to make this a stronger bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.